Before we get started, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the RSA. We're a 270-year-old organization, so born out of the London coffee house culture. For us, central to this origin story has really been the spirit of informality. The RSA has always functioned as a bit of a national improvement agency, really aggregating the goodwill of private citizens to make improvements for public benefit. In today's world, we have 31,000 fellows. And in the last 6 to 9 months, we've really been on this sense-making journey on social connection. So really excited to hear some of the different perspectives our panel are bringing, as well as the perspectives in the room. We want today to be really participatory. We'll have an opportunity for breakout rooms. Feel free to put any questions, comments in the chat. For us, this work was really kicked off by the economist Raj Chetty. He's our Benjamin Franklin medalist this year. And his most recent research found that social capital is really a key driver of economic mobility. So in other words, it's who you know that really impacts your economic destiny and your well-being. And so we've been speaking with people with lived experience around these issues. We've been speaking to a number of practitioners in the field, some of whom are panelists today, who work within the realm of social connections and social capital. And this is something that we found to be deeply humanistic. We've done our own soul searching as an organization in terms of how, as a membership organization, do we do a better job of supporting social connections through our fellowship community, how we support relationship building, serendipity, collaboration. And really important to this conversation is that sense of economic connectedness. So we're excited for this conversation, to hear from our speakers today. Also want to hear from you in the audience. Feel free to put any questions in the chat function. We'll have time for breakout rooms and Q&As as well. So excited for that. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce some of our speakers. First up, we have David J., who is the author of Relationality, How Moving from Transactional to Transformational Relationships Can Reshape Our Lonely World, and the founder of the Relationality Lab, which helps people who create relationships understand and communicate the impact of their work. He regularly advises a variety of movement leaders on strategies for building power by nurturing connection and care and supporting families of all shapes and sizes in building committed communities of care to counter parental isolation. David, thanks so much for joining you. A lot of us are also new parents, so really appreciate your focus on that parental isolation piece and excited for your wisdom here today. Next, we have Samantha Perez, who's an associate director at Education Strategy Group, and she supports a diverse portfolio of initiatives aimed at ensuring that K-12 and post-secondary students complete their education equipped with the knowledge, skills, and networks to be successful in the labor market. Over the past 2 years, she's led ESG's work on social capital, helping communities across the US more explicitly and intentionally integrate social capital tools, strategies, and resources into their work to prepare students for college and career. Thanks, Samantha. Next, we have Kevin F. Adler, who's an award-winning social entrepreneur, best-selling author. I've just started reading Kevin's book, so highly recommend it. I think DJ's book is also in the mail to me. He believes in a future where everyone is seen as invaluable and interconnected. Kevin is the founder and CEO of Miracle Messages, a nonprofit headquartered in San Francisco that helps people experiencing homelessness across the United States rebuild their social support systems and financial security, primarily through family reunifications, a phone buddy program, and the first basic income pilot for unhoused individuals in the US. So Kevin, really excited to get into that work a bit more and understand that program. Finally, we have Seth Kaplan, who's a leading expert on fragile states and the author of Fragile Neighborhoods, Repairing American Society One Zip Code at a Time. He's a lecturer in the Paul H. Nitz School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and a senior advisor for the Institute for Integrated Transitions, consultant at organizations such as the World Bank, U.S. State Department, U.S. Agency for International Development, and the OECD, as well as developing country governments and NGOs. So fantastic. We're really excited for all of our panelists to be in conversations. Seth, I thought you could kick us off. Part of the conversation that we started having was really the extent to which this is a Western problem around social isolation, the challenge of social connections. I know with some of your experiences, just cross-cultural experience has really informed your take and stance on some of these issues. Do you care to elaborate on the extent to which you think the social connection challenge is really one of the West and the ways in which you've been inspired by different cultures?
Thank you. So why don't I start by just saying a few words about my background? So this will be a bit personal. I had, let's say I had some challenges growing up. I didn't quite fit in. And then at some point when I was a college student, I had a chance to spend the summer in Istanbul, Turkey. And then as soon as I got out of college, my immediate reaction was, based upon people I met, is that I wanted to go to places with really thick relationships where people had a sense of community and belonging and togetherness. And so I literally wandered to lots of places, especially places where I felt the warmth of my surroundings. And eventually I actually built a career, wrote a book and built a career working on fragile states, places that politically they don't work great, economically people are poor, yet the connections between people are strong. They tend to have problems at the national level, but locally communities are very rich. And so with that as a background and with that lens of how relationships affect communities, but also affect societies, when people started asking me about the US, and I went on a different journey, a journey into the US as I would to some country I had worked on, I think what I discovered is that yes, we do have a lot of national problems, but what's most stands out as being different about what's not working here. We're materially well off, but we're extremely socially poor. And I think this is a dramatic change from 2 or 3 generations ago. If you go to neighborhoods and you go where people spend time, they spend time alone. They spend time isolated. I don't want to say this is a cultural thing. I think there is something to do with culture. I think it's really part about how we've designed society. We've designed society for us to have a beautiful home and have nothing in common or have no connection to our neighbors. We don't shop locally. We don't pray locally. Sometimes our kids don't go to school locally. What is it in our communities that we actually might do with even like if we're being socially active, we think urban, we think national, we don't think about what we do locally. And from my perspective, that leaves us much more at risk about being isolated and alone. And I'll just conclude by, you mentioned Raj Chetty. So Raj Chetty's work is really interesting, but the key thing to understand about his work is he's comparing neighborhoods. And he's talking about how you can be much more socially mobile. Yes, you need social capital. There's other factors, but it's part of a neighborhood effect. So you can be rich, you can be poor. I think where you live and what type of relationships and institutions exist where you live determines so much about your future, your happiness, your health. There's plenty of data on that. But if we're talking about loneliness, if you're in a socially rich neighborhood, you are much less likely to be lonely than if you're a neighbor that isolates and alienates you.
Thank you, Seth. I think that's really, really powerful. And through our conversations with folks, interviewing them around this work and getting their response to Raj Chetty's work, I think it's a really important theme that's come out is not just the focus on individual success. And that was a narrative that you really introduced through your work too. It's not just economic mobility for one individual to kind of escape and sever the ties of where they come from, but a lot of it is around that community wealth and that relational wealth. Samantha, I want to turn to you because I know a lot of your work is focused on building networks that can allow young people to be more successful. Can you unpack how you see the work of social capital and social connections being really important to that sphere?
Yep, absolutely. And thank you for having me. Thank you, Seth, for your opening comments, because a lot of what you said just resonated, especially in the education space. But I am an associate director with Education Strategy Group. If you are unfamiliar with our organization, we work with education leaders at all levels, national, state, local, to think about how we start to remove the barriers for students to access economic and social mobility. So we've historically really situated ourselves within the college and career pathway space, thinking about the transition to post-secondary, from post-secondary to career, and I sit within career readiness. And part of the reflection that we did as an organization several years ago was to say, you know, we spent a lot of time talking about work-based learning and how important that is. We've talked about career exploration. We've talked about the knowledge that students need in order to make informed decisions about where they want to go, what they aspire to in the future. But one thing that we realized is that we weren't paying attention to the fact that a very real factor in how individuals get into their career, into various occupations, is through relationships, right? We were missing a huge piece of the puzzle if we weren't recognizing that social capital is fundamental in how, you know, a student who may not know, who wants to be a doctor but doesn't know a doctor, can see the possibility of that as a goal for themselves. So we started to do, luckily we received a couple of grants to be able to do some exploratory work in this space. We don't have to do a lot of selling. Everyone understands the importance of relationships. What I think has been a less explicit priority is in how we think about the how our institutions, how our systems are actually making that an explicit expectation for how we prepare students. So I think people think of relationships and they think of them as deeply personal, which they are. But we should also be thinking about the ways in which our systems are set up to allow for relationship building, for building connections. So a lot of what we've done is help communities sort of realize where the opportunity areas are. Especially, we consider it very much an equity imperative, right? There are some students that sort of have networks that they can lean on when it comes to thinking about their future. They have parents who went to college and can have conversations with them about that journey. They have parents who, you know, maybe are in occupations that they're interested in, or relatives, and can have a conversation there. For those students who may be first generation, who may be low income, you know, how do we set them up so that they, one, recognize the value of the relationships that they already have, right? Every relationship you have, you know, most carries some value. So acknowledging that, but also giving them these skill sets to be able to build from there and think about who's not in my network and how can I start to build so that I have relationships to leverage further down the road. So Lex, I think I gave you a pretty long-winded answer, but we did quite a bit of work over the past 2 years helping communities better assess where they are in supporting students in their social capital journey, but also doing a lot of learning along the way in how our current institutions are and are not set up to do this work. It's just not currently an explicit component of what education systems feel like they should be owning.
That's great, Sam. And after we introduce other speakers, I'd love to get a sense of just some of the interventions that you're seeing within that social capital space, and, you know, how we can have a more networked approach to supporting students and young people, both in education and also in job navigation. And I think what you point out too is just the power of imagination, that so much of one's destiny is sort of contextualized by where one's born. And so the power of social connections is really about reaching out to other you know, alternative futures and being able to grasp outside of your domain, outside of your context, which is just so important to have those bridging relationships. Next, I want to bring attention to DJ's work. You've worked across a number of different movements, and so just wondering how you see this field of social capital, of social connections, really feeding into your work and vocation in social change spaces.
Thank you so much. I got started in this work when I was 18. I was this young asexual kid who had never talked to another asexual person and really felt alone. Like, received this message that I was destined to be alone forever because I wasn't forming relationships in a normative way. And I was able to create a space along with a bunch of other people online where people like me who didn't had a conversation we wanted to have and didn't have another place to talk about it could come together. And I got to see how creating that kind of path out of isolation was not only personally transformative, but it built a lot of political power. It built communities of care, and then it built political power. We were able to get delisted as a mental disorder. We were able to take on Big Pharma successfully. And so a lot of my life, a lot of my path has really been looking at where are there places where people feel that isolation, and how can, I think, echoing Samantha and Seth, what you've said, environments are really, really key. How do we create the space, the place where and invite people into it, where they can come together, have a conversation that's powerful, often about a way that they feel alone, and then from that build connection and build power. When I was working to change tech companies, which I think social media companies, which I think are having a profound impact on social isolation, I found that tech workers felt that kind of isolation. There were things they wanted to talk about, didn't know how to. So I invited them into a space where they connect with one another, and those connections have profoundly transformed, helped to shift how those companies operate, helped to shift the laws that have come out. So there was a real link between gathering, care, which I think is the thing that happens when gathering results in relationship, and then power coming from that care. Um, and so and many other people I know coming out of queer movements, coming out of other movements that I'm part of, sort of live and breathe this work and have lived and breathed it for a long time. I think we are not lonely because we lack wisdom about how to build relationship. There is really deep relational lineage, and this comes, Seth, to some of what you were talking about, traveling internationally. There is really deep cultural knowledge that our grandparents hold about how to build these environments where relationships happen. And I think we are experiencing a disconnect from that lineage. It's not like we need to invent this from scratch. We need to know that we need to reconnect with the things that our grandparents knew and adopt them to a modern context. And so the question that I've really been grappling with, to your point, Samantha, this is what my book is about. This is, I think, what the focus of my work is about, is this experience of relational invisibility that I've come across when I try to engage with institutions about this kind of work. Nonprofit institutions, funders, political campaigns, corporations, where you have these groups where many people are doing relational work, many people understand the importance of creating the conditions for relationship, but when it comes time to allocate resources, when it comes time to set strategic priorities, the work of relationship sort of turns to vapor. It becomes invisible. And I think part of the reason it does that is that it is intrinsically unpredictable. If you're building a factory, you know exactly what the factory is going to make. You can measure a KPI that tells you exactly how well the factory is going to do it, at what efficiency. If you're building relationships, and this is, I think, written into the sort of fundamental rules of how relationships work. I study relational systems and complexity theory. I have a physics background, which is another thing I won't get into. But you can predict the conditions that will lead to relationship, but not where those relationships will lead. The better you are at creating an environment for relationship, the less you know about exactly what those relationships are going to do. And I think that unpredictability and lack of control makes it hard for many institutions to think about what success in building relationships really looks like. And so a lot of what I'm inviting people into thinking about these days is, how do we help teach institutions? How do we advocate within institutions so that they understand the nature of relational work and know how to invest in it? Because there's people who have the skills that we need, and they're just not getting paid. So pause there.
Thank you, TJ. Super helpful. And I think that's something we've wrestled with at the RSA. So much of our organization is geared towards supporting relationships among our fellows. And that leads to a lot of unlikely collaborations and serendipitous conversations, and also just the ways in which fellows strengthen each other's resilience and provide, further connections in areas of support. And so it's very much something that's a live conversation that we're having and thinking about in our fellowship work. Kevin, wanted to introduce you, and I know one of the concepts in your book that I really loved was, well, not loved because it's a challenging concept, but was the idea of relational poverty. Can you talk a little bit about your work and how you see the challenge of relational poverty?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here with David, Samantha, and Seth. I have a background as a sociologist. I studied social capital in undergrad and then in grad school. And I've always just been kind of smitten with the concept. So just, a personal background. I grew up in a pretty small town with a small family. I learned from a very young age to look at my neighbors, classmates, friends as an extension of my family. We were kind of the gathering spot on Sunday dinners. And when I started doing research on social capital and, came across Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, it's like, wait, we're losing this thing that has felt so good and so fundamental to my experience. He talks about the rise and fall of social capital since about the late 1960s. And, I just wanted to understand, well, what's going on beyond just what he calls generational change? And how can we put a stop to this? Because this isn't the kind of, country I'd want to live in or raise kids in. And I've had around that time when I started going in at an academic level, it was also the time, on a personal level that I needed my network the most. My mom had breast cancer and ended up passing away. And moving back into my childhood home, getting it ready for rental, and sleeping on a mattress for 8 months in an abandoned home. The only thing that got me through that period of grieving as a 23-year-old was having keys to 3 family friends' houses, and just choosing to sleep on their couches just so I wasn't alone, right? Just wanting to be by someone in that moment of need in my life. And so, my research took me to this idea that shared traumas, disasters, earthquakes, fires, floods, wars can act either as a catalyst that bring people together or tear people apart. And that can happen at, a national level, but can also happen at very much a regional level, of what's going on in your neighborhood, as Seth brings to the table, or in a community. And so I just started thinking about how, what are the shared traumas that we've experienced in our life? Thinking of a World War II as a potentially catalytic event for many people. Obviously there's people who are excluded from that, and that sometimes gets overlooked in this conversation. That needs to be talked about. Vietnam as, a bit more of a divisive, let's push this to the outskirts kind of conflict, not asking everyone to, participate. And then looking at like 9/11, and at that time we were asked to live our lives like normal and to spend to keep the economy going. So I came from this kind of shared trauma lens on social capital, and then that brought me to this area of homelessness, which I've come to think of homelessness as this highly privatized, highly individual, almost invisible shared trauma, where people who are homeless are much better thought of as survivors of, instead of wildfires or floods or earthquakes, which sometimes is the case, broken systems of affordable housing, criminal justice system, income inequality, broken mental and behavioral health systems. And yet we don't see them as part of a collective failing in our society. We see them as, well, what did you individually do wrong? Are you deservedly poor? And we never kind of have those conversations with, survivors of actual natural disasters. We'd rally together and, say, hashtag whatever the community is strong, right? Like we do what we need to do as people. So just kind of getting back to your question, homelessness, I think, is especially interesting because it's one of the most intersectional issues of our time. And it's also working with people who are on the absolute fringes of our society. Neuroscientists at Princeton and Duke did research where they found that the medial prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that activates when we see a person compared to an inanimate object, was found not to respond when we see someone that we perceive to be experiencing homelessness. The parts that do activate are the areas that are associated in our brain with disgust. So we are seeing our unhoused neighbors in this very otherized lens. And I feel that's what sometimes is missing in the social capital conversation, even, Surgeon General making proclamations on loneliness as a health crisis and an emergency. It's very often construed in this very middle class kind of way of talking about it. Like we've all just been through a pandemic, so we were all sheltered in place. Well, what if you didn't have a place to shelter in? Oh, we're all on Zoom now. That's difficult. Well, you have an employer that's flexible enough to, give you the space to get onto Zoom and do your work remotely. You have digital access and digital connectivity to begin with, and you have people to connect to. And so, I'll share more as we go, but as I got closer to our unhoused neighbors, people who, reminded me of my uncle who lived on the streets for 30 years, and I started hearing people say, I never realized I was homeless when I lost my housing, only when I lost my so
Yeah.
that's really what brought me to this is wanting to have a term that really spoke to the life and death nature of this idea of relationships, especially for people who are on the margins of our society.
Thanks, Kevin. Really appreciate that. And I know one of the organizations we've been speaking to is Thread in Baltimore. And one of the metrics that they shared that they use for thinking about social capital is quite simple. How many people can you call at 3 a.m., right? And so as much as this is academic, I think they're just very practical ways in which people need community for everyday resilience and what that looks like. There are a few questions in the chat that I wanted to bring our attention to. One is around the theme of belonging. And so there was a question for panelists in terms of where you source your belonging from, but I think this is also a wider question. I think often with Putnam's work, there's a sort of nostalgia for a time when Americana was ripe with social connections. And in fact, that time was also very exclusionary, right? And so for a lot of people now, I think the work of belonging and reparations is equally important. So just curious if speakers have any reflection on that theme of belonging. The other comment brought up is just the role of crisis in creating these pro-social connections. I don't know, Seth, if that's something you've come across a lot in your work, but just how communities respond to crisis as a real multiplier of social connection.
Well, if you want, I noticed the person from Thread in Baltimore. So why don't we describe as an example what Thread does? And it responds to you could call it a crisis. It's not a shock that we wake up one day and we have an enormous heat wave or something like that. But Thread targets ninth graders who are the worst performing in schools in Baltimore. These are people who basically are, I think that GPA is about 0.7 or something like that. They are on the trajectory to not finish high school and basically have a very low horizon for their lives. And Thread understands this as a problem of connection, a problem of unconditional love, and it has an incredibly unique model of, you mentioned the references, how many people can you call at 3 o'clock in the morning? They create Thread families. They do something that's bridging. They get thousands of volunteers, and they have 4 volunteers available 24/7. So if I'm a ninth grader and I've had a life in which I haven't had as much supportive relationships and I haven't had the kind of unconditional love, and to link to belonging, a sense that I have a place and I have that support system that I can thrive. We all need and this goes back to the theme of our discussion here, we all need to feel that we have love, that we have people we can depend upon. I like to think of a thriving neighborhood as, I mean, for me, my neighborhood is joyful because I have this thick web of relationships. They're not friends. They're people I know. I mean, I probably know 200 people within, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes walking from my house. And so what Thread is doing is taking people who haven't had this kind of trustful, loving, unconditional loving types of support day in, day out, and they're trying to literally rewire or reset their expectations and basically give them a sense that they belong, they have unconditional love. So they have this group of 4 volunteers 24/7, helping them with anything that they need. I can recall Sarah Heminger, who runs Thread, telling me a story when there was, several years ago, there was a period when things were, I think there were some riots, there was something, an incident with the police, and the streets were not safe. And they were there at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is probably where this idea comes from. They were there to go and David brought in the traditional. And so I think a lot of this is not new. This is not rocket science. I can look at all the studies I want from whatever, but it's actually really simple. If we don't have love, we don't have relationships, it's not always friends. We don't have this kind of support, this type of like a web of support around us. And we don't feel, I mean, I have children, many people here have children. There's nothing a child wants that every moment of every day they feel safe and supportive, and they're constantly testing to see how safe and supportive they are. And imagine you're growing up and you don't have that, and then what it takes to transform that. And so, I mean, Thread is enormously labor intensive. It's a work of love from Sarah and the people who work there. And I would just say it's a great example of what we might call bridging social capital, taking people from outside a neighborhood to go in and thread a set of relationships to help a child as well as a family. And when you do that along many families and many people in a school, your hope is that you can actually have an impact on what is going on at the neighborhood level. So I hope that's a good example for your question there.
Thanks, Seth. That's great. And I'm going to put in the chat box just another link to an organization, Gatherford, that does similar work to Thread that I think is important. Just want to see if any speakers want to come in on this point around either crisis as an opportunity for social connection or belonging. DJ.
So if I could jump in quickly, I'm just really excited to hear the word reparations come up, because I think what I was saying, you know, with Seth, when you were saying the traditional, I think, yes, this is about harking back to the traditional, but it is not, it is acknowledging that there are lineages that have a lot of wisdom about how to create belonging that we are disconnected from. And often that disconnection has been, it's not an accident. It has been part of a historical project. When we look at the way that belonging existed in Black community, the way that belonging has existed in Native community, with the way that belonging has existed in disabled community, in queer communities that I hold a lot of lineage in. These are places where belonging and relationship have been the tools of survival. People have not been able to survive through transaction in the way that I, as a privileged white man in the Bay Area, largely have. And so I think those places where people survive and thrive through relationship often are seen as threatening, often are seen as sites to be, like places to be controlled and dominated. And it is that it's that history of domination and exploitation that has created this disconnection from relational lineage. And so I think a lot about how, in order to create a culture of belonging, in order to reground ourselves in in the wisdom that exists about how to belong, we need to be engaging in the work of repair. We need to be acknowledging the ways in which this wisdom about belonging has been marginalized, and investing in the work of repair to bring it back.
Thanks, DJ. Sam, wanted to bring to you, because I know before you were describing just some of the systemic challenges within education of this social connections work and how important equity is in terms of the programs that you design. And so thinking about, what does the intervention space look like? We heard from Seth in terms of just the role of bridging capital and creating those really helpful sort of pods. Around COVID, we heard about mutual aid groups. What do intervention strategies look like in your field?
Yeah, I will say that this conversation is new, right? So what we discovered is that the field is very nascent, and that bringing social capital as a more explicit component of the way that we're talking about preparing students for their future, while something that most would say, yes, absolutely, we agree, very little experience in actually doing the work. So it's a field ripe for opportunity, though I think what we also realize is that there is a whole educational ecosystem aside from schools. So oftentimes we put the onus on schools, school leaders, teachers, staff to do a lot of the hard work. They're situated within a broader ecosystem of different institutions that are interacting with students. So Brian's question around what other spaces do you feel a sense of belonging? I could think of sports teams, right? I could think of churches. I could think of after-school programs. I could think of the myriad of networks in which students are embedded, and the opportunities that lie there for there to be stronger connection building and how we're supporting students. And we saw during Seth's comments really resonated with me, and made me think about the pandemic and what we saw happen during the pandemic when schools were trying to respond to this crisis and realize we're not in a position right now to think about academics, right? We just want to make sure that our people are okay. And the sort of mind shift that happened in, okay, or the recognition from individuals outside of the educational system that our schools do a lot more than just educate our students, right? They are probably often the first line of defense when it comes to things like, do our students have a place to lay their head down at night? Are our students being fed? Are their families okay? Is there something going on? And so I think there's an opportunity right now to really help our educational ecosystem recognize the power of connectedness stemming from what we've learned over the course of the pandemic and what that crisis taught us about the very real situations in which our students are living in. So new fields, and I will say that in the work that we did with our communities across the U.S. took very different approaches to doing this work. We had some communities that looked to work-based learning programs, like apprenticeship programs, and the opportunities there to get past the assumption that just because you put students into a work situation that there is actual connection building. And so thinking about the explicitness of expectation when it comes to worksite supervisor, you're hosting a student. It's not just making sure that they're on task. It's also thinking about how you build authentic, genuine connection there, how you might introduce them to others in your network to build upon their own connections. We saw work happening in college access spaces with organizations who were helping students fill out FAFSAs, fill out their college essays, thinking about who else might we connect them to within university settings or colleges that might provide them a different perspective. So a variety of approaches. I would say very nascent right now, but big learning for us is just the importance of that educational ecosystem and bringing in organizations that aren't just schools, but are the other anchors within a student's sort of social life.
Thanks, Samantha. And that's definitely something we've been finding in our conversations today, just how nascent this field is, but how social connections or social capital is such an important instrument across so many domains, right? From if you care about poverty alleviation, economic inclusion, mental health, alienation and well-being, this is something that we're seeing is really important and intersectional across different programs of work. And so really want to spotlight it and give opportunity for practitioners to connect and say, how are you embedding this in your programs? How are you, capturing longitudinal data on the role that social capital interventions can play on, long-term outcomes. So really excited to be at the early phases of this field and help, steward some of these conversations and connect people across these silos. I know we wanted to shift to breakout groups. So what I might just do, Kevin, before I sort of give you the option of the last word, is just pause. And if anyone has any topics they'd love to pursue in breakout conversations, anything that you might have come to this conversation wanting to discuss, or anything that you've heard today that you'd like to go a little bit deeper on, please share that in the chat. We also have some pre-populated ideas of breakout rooms, so we'll share those in the chat too in terms of some of our suggestions, and then we'll be moving to breakout groups shortly. But Kevin, final words, as we're in this panel format in terms of, your reflections. I know you've done a lot of work too around sort of basic income and linking that with social capital. That's been a historic area of the RSAs. And so really interested in learnings that you've had around that.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. I'll try to keep it brief for the breakouts because that's exciting. I think what I'll do is maybe share just a little bit more of a deep dive on the work we do, and then I'm left with more questions than answers today. So maybe I'm just going to surface some of the questions that are kind of resonating for me after listening to my other, panelists. At Miracle Messages, the work we really have started with was around family and friend reunification. When we realize that many of our unhoused neighbors are disconnected from loved ones that they may want to reconnect to, and that it's a combination of digital literacy, bureaucratic barriers, and shame and stigma and stereotypes that have kept many people disconnected. We thought it would be helpful to facilitate some of those reconnections, and so that's what we started with. But what's really exciting, I'm a big fan of Brian Stevenson, and he has a concept of getting proximate. The more proximate we got, and actually I'd push that further, I think we have to get relational. The more relational we got with our unhoused neighbors, we started hearing the flaws in our own model. We started hearing where we were falling short. We hear from people who said, hey, I'd love to reconnect to someone. I have relational poverty. I'm experiencing that. But for me, family is part of the problem, not part of the solution. Bridges have been burned. It's not safe for me to reconnect. In the US, I believe the stats are like 9% of the youth population are LGBTQ. Where about 40% of the unaccompanied youth are LGBTQ. If the family is not accepting, if it's not safe, or if they don't have resources to provide, then what? What are you going to do? And that's what led us to then create a phone buddy program in the early months of the pandemic, connecting unhoused individuals with volunteers all around the country for weekly phone calls and text messages. And we worked with the city of San Francisco on that, recognizing that 4 walls and a roof don't make a house a home. We had shelter-in-place hotels, but folks were isolated. And, the depression, suicidal ideation, all sorts of, unfortunate, events were on the rise because of the lack of connection. And then through those relationships and that phone buddy program that we continue to operate, we started hearing from our volunteers and people consistently saying, hey, you've asked me to be friends with this person, but it's very hard to be on equal footing if they don't know what they're going to do to get food on the table tonight, or they don't know how they're going to put gas in their car and get back to work on Monday, because about 40% of our unhoused neighbors have jobs, 45%. And so that's what led us to say, well, let's raise some money and just give it to people directly. And we did that through a nomination process initially, where we had volunteers nominate their friends, $500 a month for 6 months, no questions asked. And within 6 months, 2/3 of those unhoused individuals secured housing. So we've now expanded that pilot into a $2.1 million randomized control trial. We're working with researchers at USC, Google.org to explore some of these questions around $750 a month for 12 months, plus a phone buddy. What does a little bit of cash and social support lead? What kind of outcomes does that lead to for our unhoused neighbors? So that's the work that we do. I think some questions that come to mind. So first, we have this question always that, why are there so many people experiencing homelessness? Super important question. But a question that never gets asked, with 1 out of every 2 Americans a paycheck away from not being able to pay rent, and 40% of people saying they don't know where they'd get $400 for an unexpected emergency, you almost have to ask, why aren't more people experiencing homelessness? What's making up the difference? I think David brought up some of the rich lineages where social capital and relationships are critical to populations groups getting by. That's still happening today, as David knows super well. And what we're seeing among homelessness is family, friends, community, church, synagogue, mosque, informal economy. That's really making up the difference. People are doubling up, tripling up, supporting each other. And that's the last barrier before falling into homelessness. And that's, I think, one of the explanations I wrote about in my book, When We Walk By, on why African Americans generally enter homelessness at lower levels of mental health issues, lower levels of substance addiction, and higher levels of income than white individuals. And the explanation is that the individuals who are Black are coming from families, communities that historically have much fewer resources. There's much less margin for error if something goes wrong. Whereas if you're white, you have a little bit more opportunity historically and continued with resources. So that's one. And then the only other question I'd put forward, I'm so struck by Seth's work around neighborhoods. I think it's so critical. When I think about neighborhoods and I think about homelessness, the word inclusion and exclusion comes to mind. There's a lot of NIMBYism. There's a lot of who's in, who's not in, who's part of our neighborhoods. So I'm really interested, if neighborhoods are so critical to support, reinforce as part of this conversation, how do we make sure that we recognize our unhoused neighbors were by and large once our housed neighbors, and that they belong in a community just as much as we do? So those are just a few musings and thoughts as I've been listening to other panelists and what I'd like to share.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Super, super helpful. In my group, we ended up having really interesting conversations just around the lifestyle dynamics of this. Like, how personally do we commit to this social connections work in our own lives? What does that look like in terms of our own efforts at community building, et cetera? But just want to open up and see if anyone wants to share.
Say your name correctly, please forgive me if I don't, who's from an island in the Pacific, and she spoke about the relationships and the rituals that they had in their society that helped sustain and relationships and help them flourish, and how much of this was lacking in America. I think you have some of it around religion, but going to some activity and just dancing or something like that, I don't think quite replaces what she had in her society. I think she's from the Republic of Palau, which I've never been to, but is absolutely beautiful if anyone wants to visit. It's just far away. And the second topic we had is I think it's Brian, if I'm getting your name correctly, who's developing an app for neighborhood connections. And he's the third person I've spoken to who's doing something like that. They all have different variations. And he's from Nova Scotia. But the idea, I think it's so clear that technology is a big driver of disconnection. And I don't mean that technology that we want to refer to as social media and internet. I think that's an accelerator. But if you think that we used to have strong connections, let's say a couple of generations ago, starting with the car, starting with how we designed the physical landscape to basically make cars the center of our lives, and all the other technologies that have come in the many generations. You could talk about cable TV and streaming, and you go on and on and on, all the reasons for us not to be with each other. And of course, internet and social media is an accelerant of that trend. And so I think if we can find technology that brings us together around place, particularly neighborhoods, I'm really looking for ideas in that space. And I was so happy Brian Braun, as he puts his name in the chat, brought that to me, and I'm certainly going to take advantage of this opportunity and learn more from Brian, and maybe introduce him to the two other people I know who are doing that, because what we really need is find ways for technology to help us have better relationships. And I personally think it's much easier if you have an offline and you have a common place, and then you build a web of relationships through technology, than if you're trying to be completely virtual. That'll work for some people. That certainly will not work for most people.
Barry gives you the thumbs up, Seth, in your reporting. So
Yeah,
wonderful.
I think Brian and I were very much on the same page about what might work, except he knows technology, and you wouldn't want me to do anything with technology. Thank you so much.
That's terrific. Anyone else want to share what's come up through some of the breakout conversation? Kevin, it sounds like y'all had a great chat. Do you want to share any?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think I first just want to acknowledge Brian, Shirley, Amy. It was really special. We kind of recognized the constraint of 10 or 12 minutes, which we then exceeded and broke, but that's okay. And we kind of stepped into the space and said, let's try to be a little bit more personal and vulnerable about where we're coming into this work. I think Shirley was the one who mentioned vulnerability as a key ingredient to building relationships. And, I started toward the end reflecting on how choosing whether to share our vulnerabilities, the act of choice, is such a privilege. If we can hide that which makes us vulnerable, that's already a place of privilege. We were talking about homelessness, where your vulnerabilities are raw, ready to be seen. So, one thing I'd maybe uplift, and Brian had a wonderful practice that he shared from his experience at Thread, something along the lines, and maybe he'll chime in to share more if we'd like, around what you see when you see me that you don't recognize, that you wouldn't know, and so we kind of had this wonderful question of like, let's meet each other where we're at and not leave us there. Right? What are the biases? What are the assumptions? Here's this person, this age, this gender, this race, here's their life experiences. What's under the surface that's not apparent? And I appreciated that a lot, because I personally, when I think about some of the challenges around social connection right now, I think of a lot of it around this, like, not, I mean, we heard a little bit from Seth about technology, but I think it's as much what technology does to our minds and our hearts. We're in this cycle of self-righteousness. Everyone is just constantly presuming they know everything about everything, and it breeds polarization and, black and white thinking, and which group are you in, which group are you out? And life is complex, life is nuanced and messy. And so I think to be able to not start from a place of, here, declarative statement, this is how it works and this is what it needs to be, but starting from a place of, here's what I've experienced in life. Here's what's been hard for me. Here's what's been challenging. Here's what I'm still wrestling with. Here's what I'm working through. Here's what I had in childhood. Here's how that affects my work. I just know, as almost like a petri dish, I feel much closer to my fellow panelists in the breakout group than I would have if we had just said, wellness, what's the latest article? What's the latest research finding? So I just want to, again, acknowledge both the people who were in my panel, who went on that journey with me, and then just think about how we can carry that forward to to bring a little bit more humility and self-effacement to this work and to our interactions.
Thank you, Kevin. I love that question. I'm definitely going to be stealing that for future conversations. So love it. Anyone else want to share, Samantha or?
Sure.
Yeah.
I can jump in. I know Mary Lou left, and we were a small and mighty group of two, so we had a great conversation, a lot around safety, and the work that she's doing within St. Mary's College to try to build safety and hope for students that are feeling very disillusioned and just frightened at the social political context within Texas. So she's based in San Antonio, Texas, and the rhetoric that they're hearing, a lot of whom are first generation, they are undocumented or come from mixed status families. And she's finding that as an English professor, like, I need to create spaces for building hope, for allowing them to be creative, in the pursuit of giving them a safe space, where they can make sense of all of the external noise that affects their day-to-day. So some good conversation around what institutions can be doing, even institutions located within, tense sort of political contexts, to create a sense of safety that then helps make connections and bridge people together that are experiencing similar fears, but was very much inspired by the work that Mary Lynn's doing, just her thinking around like who her student population is and what they need, not just academically, but almost emotionally.
Wow, that's great. Really, really fascinating to hear about that. Thanks, Sam, for sharing. DJ, anything from your group you wanted to share?
Yeah, we had just such a beautiful conversation about, I think, the shared experience that most of the folks in the room had of being parents of autistic kids, and how that's led to isolation from community, how that's led to like the challenges of figuring out relationship um, in community and figuring out support with neurodiverse folks, and how rich and powerful it can be when that gets figured out. I think we had a really beautiful conversation about the things we've learned about how to connect from the autistic people in our lives. Um, Things about like how to connect around passion, how to like be unapologetic about feeling joy in our bodies. Um, and uh, and at, I personally just feeling a lot of gratitude around how going into these places where connection is, not normal, can be a uh, a real source of inspiration and wisdom, because normal isn't working.
Beautiful. Love that. Thank you for sharing. Any final thoughts from anyone before we conclude? We'll just give some space. Oh, thanks, Colleen. Thanks for joining.
I mean, I would just say, again, I don't know everyone's background, but to the extent that you can get out in your community and you can find, and you can think small and just find activities or organizations you can be involved with. Never underestimate the idea of volunteering, especially if you can do something recurring or find something that's going on. If you want to be more ambitious, find several other people who live nearby you and see, can you do a block party? Can you do something that's a little more regular? What would it take to change the norm around your neighborhood? I have a friend, Mac McCarter in Shreveport, who started just like that. Another guy also, actually similar thing in Edmonton, and just started doing something locally. And in Mac McCarter's case, he eventually has this organization with literally block connectors and neighborhood connectors, and he has people who commit to a pledge, we care, and they put signs on their front yard that we care. This is Community Renewal International. If somebody wants to put the website link in the chat, and he has 50,000, at least he says. I haven't gone around and counted, so you'll forgive me. I haven't personally verified 50,000, but if you drive around Shreveport and the town right across from Shreveport, I forget the name, across the river, you have these "We Care" signs all over the place, and he has 50,000 committed that we will norm caring about our neighbors and our relationships. And that's in a place of 300,000. So about 1 out of every 6 people. And then he also, for neighborhoods that needed additional help, he raised money and literally has 2 people living in a friendship house in the neighborhood, typically have 2 houses, to help those people not only with their bonding, but also to connect to other things they might need. But the whole idea is not to think of material wants, think about relationships, think about what assets people have, think about changing norms. And in the city of Edmonton's case, they actually saw what this guy Howard Jacobson was doing, and they hired him. And the city has an office of neighborhoods, and they have 4 staff people, and their only purpose is to nurture neighborhood connection. Because it used to be we organically had relationships. Today, we individually must be intentional. And I think a big question for our society is, whether you're a social leader or a policy maker or whatever it is, how do we incorporate these ideas and be much more intentional about creating a society where we care and we nurture each other as a habit, because it's not happening by accident like it used to.
Thank you, Seth. I think that's such an important note to end on. It's not accidental. So how do we do this work intentionally? How do we become credible sort of messengers for social connections and changing norms in our own communities? I really appreciate that. For those who want to stay and be part of future conversations like this, social connections is actively a theme of conversation we're nurturing amongst our fellows. So we'll have regular events and conversational series around this topic. We have an event in New York on May 16th that we'll share more details about following up, where we'll be awarding Raj Chetty our Benjamin Franklin Medal, but also hearing from practitioners working on social connection and trying to create some wonderful opportunities for relationship building there too. So stay tuned. We'll share and follow up the recording from the session for anyone who's interested. And just really want to thank our speakers for today. Thank you for bringing it. Thank you for being vulnerable. Thank you for being open to being in conversation with people and not just a sort of talking head on a panel. Really appreciate the work you're doing and the powerful provocations you shared with us today.